December the 20th, 1943. The sky over Germany was a killing field painted in shades of grey and black, dotted with the angry bursts of flak explosions that looked like malevolent flowers blooming at 27,000 feet. Inside the battered hull of a B-17 flying fortress nicknamed Olde Pub, 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown fought to keep his bomber level as it limped through hostile airspace, trailing smoke and leaving a crimson path across the frozen German landscape below. Half his crew lay wounded or dying. The tail gunner had been decapitated by a cannon shell. Ice-cold winds screamed through gaping holes in the fuselage where the plexiglass nose had been blown completely away. One engine was dead, another was failing, and the rudder hung by threads of torn metal. And then, through the haze of pain and desperation, Brown saw it. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter, pulling up alongside his crippled bomber, close enough that he could see the German pilot's face through the canopy. This was it. The end. The German ace had them cold, defenceless, a sitting duck at barely 1,000 feet of altitude. One squeeze of the trigger and Ye Olde Pub would become another statistic, another 10 names added to the growing list of crews who never made it home. What happened next would be classified as top secret by the US 8th Air Force, hidden away for decades because it defied everything both sides understood about the nature of war. The German pilot didn't fire. Instead, he did something that made no tactical sense, violated his orders, and could have gotten him executed by his own command. He became their guardian. He escorted them to safety. This is the story of an impossible act of mercy in the middle of total war, and how two enemies became brothers. The mission had been cursed from the beginning. It was the first combat mission for Brown and his crew of Ye Olde Pub, part of the 379th Bombardment Group stationed at RAF Kimbolton in England. Their target was a Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, one of Germany's most heavily defended cities, ringed by more than 250 flak guns and swarming with Luftwaffe fighters. The pre-mission briefing had been brutally honest. They might encounter hundreds of German fighters. Many crews wouldn't be coming back. Brown's plane had been assigned to fly Purple Heart Corner, the edge position of the formation, where the Germans concentrated their attacks, knowing the stragglers and the aircraft on the periphery were the most vulnerable. The formation of nearly 500 B-17s crossed into German airspace shortly after 11 that morning, and the sky immediately erupted into chaos. Flak began bursting around them with terrifying accuracy, each explosion sending red-hot shrapnel slicing through aluminum skin and human flesh alike. The temperature outside was 60 degrees below 0 Celsius, cold enough that the morphine syrettes the crew carried had frozen solid, useless for treating the wounds that were about to come. They began their 10-minute bomb run at 27,000 feet, flying straight and level, unable to take evasive action, while the bombardier lined up the target. This was when bombers were most vulnerable, committed to their course while German gunners below adjusted their aim. The first shell hit before they could release their bombs. The plexiglass nose shattered into 1,000 pieces, exploding inward and smashing against the windshield. Miraculously, the men in the nose compartment weren't hit, but now Arctic winds tore through the aircraft at 200 miles per hour. Another shell found the engine number 2, and it died in a coughing sputter of smoke and flame. Then engine number 4 on the opposite wing took damage, spinning wildly out of control as Charlie Brown fought the controls to prevent the wing from tearing completely off. Another explosion ripped through the aircraft's roof, and shrapnel tore into Brown's right shoulder. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but there was no time to process it. They still had a mission to complete. The bombs fell away, and Ye Olde Pub gave a violent lurch as 12 500-pound bombs tumbled down toward the smoking city below. But their troubles had only just begun. Having fallen slightly behind the formation during the bomb run, they became the target every German fighter pilot dreamed of finding, a straggler, separated from the protection of the group, wounded and vulnerable. What followed was 10 minutes of sustained hell. More than a dozen German fighters, a mix of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, dove on the crippled bomber like wolves on an injured deer. They came from every angle, their cannons and machine guns tearing through the B-17's airframe. Engine number 3 took hits and was reduced to half power. Now they were flying on effectively 40% of their rated power, not nearly enough to maintain altitude or keep up with the formation disappearing into the distance. The defensive guns that should have protected them fell silent one by one as gunners were hit or their weapons were destroyed. The radio operator took shrapnel to the leg, a wound that would have been agonising if not for the shock and adrenaline. The ball turret gunner, Sam Blackford, watched helplessly as his position was riddled with holes, the mechanisms freezing in the -60-degree cold. The waist gunner's feet went numb as the heating wires in their flight suits shorted out, and in the tail, Bombardier Hugh Eckenrode died instantly when a cannon shell found him, nearly decapitating him at his station. Blood ran down the barrels of the tail guns and froze in the extreme altitude. Then the world went sideways. The damage to the rudder and controls sent the Olde Pub into a violent spin, corkscrewing toward the earth as Charlie Brown and his co-pilot Spencer Luke fought the yoke with everything they had. Both pilots had been without oxygen when their tank was punctured, and Brown's memories of those moments are hazy, fragmented by hypoxia and blood loss. He would later recall dodging trees, buildings flashing past in a terrifying blur, but he couldn't be sure what was real and what were the nightmares that would haunt him for decades. Somehow, through skill or divine intervention or sheer stubborn refusal to die, they pulled out of the spin just above the ground, levelling off at roughly 1,000 feet. They were alive, barely, and now facing a new nightmare. They had to fly 250 miles across Germany and occupied territory to reach the safety of England in an aircraft that by all rights shouldn't be flying at all. As they skimmed low over the German countryside, they passed directly over a Luftwaffe airfield. On the ground, a pilot named Franz Stigler watched the crippled bomber lumber past. So low he could see the damage clearly, so close he could make out the desperate faces in the shattered windows. Stigler had already had a remarkable day. He'd shot down 2 B-17s earlier in the mission, and was on the ground refuelling and rearming when Ye Olde Pub flew by. One more bomber would earn him the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military decorations, the dream of every fighter pilot. This was his chance, gift-wrapped and limping directly past him. He scrambled into his Messerschmitt Bf 109 and took off in pursuit. The damaged bomber wouldn't stand a chance. Franz Stigler was 28 years old, 7 years older than Charlie Brown, and he'd seen more than his share of death in the skies over North Africa, Sicily and Europe. He'd lost his brother August to a crash during a night bombing mission to London. He'd watched friends spiral down in flames, had himself been shot down multiple times, bailing out 6 times and crash landing 11 more. He had 22 confirmed victories, making him an ace several times over, and he flew with Jagdgeschwader 27, a unit that had earned a fearsome reputation fighting against British and American air forces. But Franz Stigler had also been shaped by something else, something that would matter more in the next few minutes than all his training and all his victories combined. His commanding officer in North Africa had been Gustav Rödel, a man who believed in a code of honour that seemed archaic even in the 1940s. Rödel had told his pilots repeatedly, "You are fighter pilots first, last, always. If I ever hear of any of you shooting at someone in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." The code was simple. Fight with ferocity, yes, but with honour. Warriors fought warriors, but you didn't take advantage of the helpless. You didn't shoot men who were defenceless, who had already effectively surrendered by virtue of their inability to resist. That code, beaten into Franz Stigler during his time under Rödel's command, had become part of who he was. As Stigler closed in on Ye Olde Pub from behind, positioning himself for the perfect killing shot, he saw something that made his finger freeze on the trigger. The tail gunner wasn't moving. As he drew closer, he could see why. The man was slumped over, clearly gone, blood frozen on the barrels of his guns. The tail was torn to pieces, the rudder barely attached, holes so large he could see right through the fuselage into the bomber's interior. He flew up alongside the crippled aircraft close enough to look directly into the side windows, and what he saw there changed everything. He could see wounded men inside, some being tended by their crewmates, others simply staring out at him with a glazed expression of shock. He could see the fear, the desperation, the knowledge that they were about to be finished off. These weren't warriors anymore. They were half-dead men in a flying wreck, men who had fought their battle and lost, who were simply trying to survive long enough to get home. Franz Stigler's hand moved to his jacket pocket, feeling the rosary beads his devoutly Catholic mother had given him. The words of Gustav Rödel echoed in his mind. Shooting at a man in a parachute. That's what this was, he realised. These men were effectively in a parachute. They couldn't fight back, couldn't defend themselves, were completely at his mercy. and Franz Stigler made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not have this on his conscience. He would not earn his Knight's Cross this way. Instead, he would do something that could get him court-martialed and executed. He would save them. He pulled up alongside Olde Pub, flying formation on the bomber's port wing, close enough that he could see Charlie Brown's shocked, confused face looking back at him. Stigler tried everything to communicate. He waved, gestured, pointed, trying to tell Brown to land his plane in Germany and surrender, or better yet, turn toward neutral Sweden, where the crew would receive medical treatment and sit out the rest of the war as comfortable internees. But Brown didn't understand, or perhaps he understood but simply refused. He was going to fly to England or die trying. Seeing that his attempts to communicate were failing, Stigler made a different decision. If they were determined to make it home, he would escort them there, or at least he'd escort them as far as he could. What followed was one of the most surreal passages of the entire war. A German fighter ace flew formation with an American bomber, not hunting it, but protecting it. As they approached the heavily defended German coastline, studded with flak batteries that had standing orders to fire on any aircraft that approached, Stigler stayed glued to the B-17's wing. The German gunners on the ground, seeing one of their own Messerschmitts in close formation, held their fire. They must have assumed it was an escort bringing in a captured aircraft, or perhaps they simply trusted that their pilot knew what he was doing. The flak guns stayed silent as the impossible pair flew over the Atlantic wall and out toward the North Sea. Inside Olde Pub, the crew's emotions ran from terror to confusion to cautious, desperate hope. Sam Blackford in the bull turret watched the German pilot through his turret's clear dome, their eyes meeting across a few dozen feet of sky. He waited for the attack that never came. Charlie Brown, struggling to keep the damaged bomber airborne, kept glancing over at the Messerschmitt, trying to understand what was happening, whether this was some kind of trick or trap. He ordered his top turret gunner to train his guns on the German fighter but not to fire, a warning to back off. Stigler saw the gesture and understood. He stayed where he was, protecting them from the guns below until they cleared the coast. Once they were over open water, safely beyond the range of German guns, Franz Stigler knew his task was complete. There was nothing more he could do for them. The North Sea crossing would be brutal in their damaged state, but it was their only path home. He pulled up in front of the B-17 one last time, rocked his wings in the universal pilot's salute, and then banked away sharply, disappearing back toward the German coast. The entire escort had lasted perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, but it had saved their lives. Charlie Brown, exhausted, bleeding, and still not entirely certain what had just happened, watched the German fighter vanish and understood one thing with absolute certainty. Whoever that pilot was, he was a good man. The flight across the North Sea was a different kind of hell. With minimal power, damaged controls and wounded crew, every minute felt like it might be their last. They flew just above the wave tops, so low that if they dropped any further, they would have cartwheeled into the freezing water and been gone in seconds. The crew discussed bailing out, but realised that Hugh Eckenrode's death meant they were missing a man, and more critically, the severely wounded radio operator couldn't possibly survive a parachute jump into the North Sea. They would all make it home, or none of them would. 250 miles of open water stretched before them, and the bomber that shouldn't have been flying somehow kept flying. Against all odds, against everything that physics and probability suggested was possible, Olde Pub made it to England. They limped into RAF Seething, home of the 448th Bomb Group, not their own base but the closest friendly airfield they could reach. The landing was rough, the bomber's damaged systems screaming in protest, but they touched down and rolled to a stop. 9 men climbed out of that wreck alive. They had survived what should have been unsurvivable, and they knew they owed their lives to the skill of their pilot, the toughness of their aircraft, and the mercy of an enemy who had chosen humanity over duty. At the debriefing, Charlie Brown told his commanding officers about the German fighter pilot who had escorted them to safety, who had protected them rather than destroyed them. The response was immediate and unequivocal. The encounter was classified as top secret. Brown was ordered not to speak of it to anyone, not even the rest of his squadron. The reason given was operational security, but there was something else at work, something more uncomfortable. The military didn't want stories circulating about German pilots showing mercy, about the enemy being human. It was easier to fight when the enemy remained faceless, inhuman, purely evil. A German pilot risking his own life to save an American crew complicated that narrative in ways the command structure wasn't prepared to handle. so the story was buried, locked away in classified files where it would remain for decades. On the German side, Franz Stigler said nothing to anyone about what he had done. He knew the risks. In Nazi Germany, particularly in the closing years of the war when the regime was becoming increasingly desperate and paranoid, showing mercy to the enemy could be interpreted as treason. The penalty was execution, often after torture to extract confessions of other acts of disloyalty. So Stigler kept his secret, never claiming that particular encounter in his after-action reports, never mentioning to his fellow pilots that he'd let an American bomber escape. The incident would haunt him for the rest of his life in a different way than it haunted Charlie Brown. Where Brown wondered about the identity of his mysterious guardian, Stigler wondered if the bomber had made it home. Had his act of mercy been worth the risk? Had those men survived, or had they crashed into the North Sea minutes after he'd left them? For decades, he would have no answer. Charlie Brown completed his combat tour, flying more missions and surviving the war. After returning to West Virginia, he went to college and eventually rejoined the newly formed United States Air Force in 1949, serving until 1965. He later worked for the State Department, making numerous trips to Laos and Vietnam during another war. In 1972, he retired from government service and settled in Miami, Florida, becoming an inventor and entrepreneur. Throughout all of this, the memory of that German pilot remained vivid in his mind, an image that appeared in his dreams and his nightmares with equal frequency. He never forgot the salute, the moment when an enemy had become something else, something he didn't have words for. Franz Stigler survived the war as well, though not without further trials. He transitioned to flying the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter with Jadverband 44, an elite unit formed near the war's end. When Germany surrendered in 1945, he found himself in a devastated nation, his world destroyed, his future uncertain. In 1953, he emigrated to Canada, settling in Vancouver where he became a successful businessman, building a new life far from the ruins of the country he'd fought for. Like Charlie Brown, he carried the memory of that December day, wondering about the fate of the men he'd escorted, hoping his decision to spare them had meant something. For 40 years, both men carried their secret memories of that impossible encounter. Then, in 1986, everything changed. Charlie Brown, now a retired lieutenant colonel, was invited to speak at a reunion called the Gathering of Eagles at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. During a question and answer session, someone asked him if he had any particularly memorable missions from the war. Brown paused, thinking about what he could and couldn't say, about the secret that had been classified for so long, and then he decided to tell the story. He spoke about the German pilot who had spared them, who had escorted them to safety, who had shown mercy when the rules of war demanded destruction. The reaction was immediate and powerful. People were stunned by the story, moved by it, and many encouraged him to try to find the pilot. Brown began a search that would consume the next 4 years of his life. He wrote to Air Force Historical Archives, both American and German. He contacted the West German Air Force, hoping they might have records that could shed light on who had been flying that day near Bremen. He searched through countless documents, following leads that went nowhere, hitting dead ends again and again. Finally, in desperation, he wrote a letter to a Combat Pilot Association newsletter, describing the encounter and asking if anyone knew who the German pilot might have been. The letter was a shot in the dark, a Hail Mary with no real expectation of success. So much time had passed. So many pilots hadn't survived the war. What were the chances? A few months later, Brown received a letter from Canada. It was short, almost terse, but it contained words that would change everything. I was the one. The letter was from Franz Stigler, who had seen Brown's query in the newsletter and immediately recognized the description of the encounter. When they spoke on the phone for the first time, separated by 4 decades and thousands of miles, but connected by one impossible day in December 1943, Stigler described his aircraft, the escort, the salute, every detail matching Brown's memories perfectly. They had found each other. The mystery that had haunted both of them for 40 years was solved. What happened next was perhaps even more remarkable than their original encounter. These two men, former enemies from opposite sides of a terrible war, became close friends. Not casual acquaintances or occasional correspondence, but genuine, deep friends who spoke regularly, visited each other, and formed a bond that would last until the end of their lives. They travelled together to air shows and military events, telling their story to anyone who would listen. They met each other's families. They became, in Franz's words, like brothers. In 1990, they met in person for the first time at a reunion of the 379th Bomb Group in Massachusetts. The other survivors of Ye Olde Pub's crew were there, along with their families. When Franz Stigler walked into the room, these men who had been enemies 47 years earlier embraced like long-lost relatives. Some of them wept. The crew members thanked Stigler for his mercy, for the gift of life he'd given them. But Stigler believed he was the one who had received a gift. In the book he gave to Charlie Brown, he wrote an inscription that captured the profound impact of their friendship. In 1940, I lost my only brother as a night fighter. On December 20th, 1943, I was able to save a B-17 from its destruction, a plane that had 10 human beings inside. The pilot, Charlie Brown, is for me as precious as my brother was. Thanks, Charlie. Your brother Franz. Their story eventually became a New York Times best-selling book, A Higher Call, written by Adam Makos and published in 2012. The book details not just their famous encounter, but their entire lives, the paths that led them to that moment in the sky over Germany, and the friendship that grew from it. When Makos first contacted Brown about doing an interview, Brown told him something revealing. If you want to know the whole story, learn about Franz Stigler first. In this story, I'm just a character. Franz Stigler is the real hero. Both men lived to see their story shared with the world, though not for long. Franz Stigler passed away on March 22, 2008, at the age of 92. Charlie Brown followed him on November 24th of the same year, just 8 months later, at the age of 86. They had remained close friends until the very end, their bond transcending nationality, former enmity, and the terrible war that had brought them together. Their story stands as a testament to something profoundly important, something that's easy to forget in times of conflict, that even in the darkest hours, in the middle of industrial-scale death and destruction, individual acts of mercy and humanity can survive. That the designation of enemy is a political and military construct, but humanity is deeper, more fundamental, more real. Franz Stigler risked everything for men he didn't know, men who hours earlier had been dropping bombs on his homeland, men who represented a military force trying to destroy his country. He did it not because of some grand political statement, not because he opposed the war or his government, but because in that moment, when he looked into that crippled bomber and saw wounded, desperate men who couldn't fight back, he saw human beings, and his code, his sense of honour, the teachings of Gustav Rödel, his faith, his conscience, all of it demanded that he act with mercy. He chose his humanity over his orders, his compassion over his ambition, and in doing so he gave life to 9 men who would have otherwise certainly perished. The ripples of that decision extended far beyond those 9 lives. Charlie Brown and the other survivors went on to have families, children, grandchildren. When Franz Stigler attended that reunion in 1990, he was surrounded by people who existed because of his choice, the descendants of the crew he'd saved, 25 people who were alive because on one December day in 1943, a German pilot had answered a higher call. The story resonates because it reminds us that war, for all its industrial scale and mechanical horror, is ultimately composed of individual moments, individual choices, and in those moments, people can choose to be more than what the circumstances demand. They can choose mercy, honour, humanity, even when the cost is high and the reward uncertain. If you found this story as powerful and moving as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are thousands of untold stories from history that deserve to be remembered, moments of unexpected humanity in the midst of inhumanity, connections formed across the battle lines that remind us of what we share rather than what divides us. The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler is one of the most remarkable of these, but it's far from the only one, and these stories matter now more than ever. In a world that often seems determined to emphasize our differences, to create divisions and animosity between people, we need to remember that humanity transcends all of that. We need to remember that former enemies can become brothers, that the person on the other side of any divide is still a person, deserving of dignity and capable of extraordinary compassion. Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown showed us that. and their friendship, born from one impossible act of mercy in the winter sky over Germany, stands as proof that even in the darkest times light can break through.